Modern collecting of retro gaming can be quite expensive, and as someone who constantly seeks to find these pieces of gaming history, it can carry quite a price. Even with my budget, there's some occasions where I just can't afford games because they are incredibly expensive, or for less, I can afford many more games for a console of my choice. But talking about price points, it can be weird because the market is dynamic, and I feel the only way to really cover this topic is to create 3 different episodes. One focusing on expensive games that are practical to buy, ones that are impractical to buy, and the ones that are so rare you'll likely never see them in person. Today I'm going to cover the ones that are impractical. These games are just expensive to be expensive, and more often than not are tied to limited or late releases for the Super Nintendo, and as such, you're going to pay what I would consider an unreasonable amount of money to own them. Let's begin. Starting off our list today is one of the most difficult Castlevania games to ever come out, Dracula X, also known as Akumajo Dracula XX, also known as Vampire's Kiss, really depends on where you were from. Now this game is hit or miss because most people will see a badass Castlevania game that stands strong next to Super Castlevania 4, but others will see a downgrade, because in many ways, it is. Basically, Dracula X is a remake of another 16-bit Castlevania known as Akuma Dracula Chino Rondo or Rondo of Blood, which is an amazing game. However, it was only released in Japan for the PC Engine Super CD-ROM 2. So what Konami did was take a really badass game chocked to the brim with voice acting, Red Book audio, and badass sprite work, and muddled it down into what we know as Dracula X. Now that doesn't mean Dracula X is a bad game, it isn't. In fact, it's quite a great game, but if you compare it to what it's based off of, you'll probably see some oddities, right? Now in the game we play as Richter Belmont, going to rescue his girlfriend Annette, and Annette's little sister, Maria. Now, as a man with a wiener, I can relate to the nobility of what he's doing because nothing screams, "I'm getting some tonight," like rescuing your girlfriend and your girlfriend's sister. True story. Dracula X is one of those games that fluctuate a little bit, but you're probably going to look around the neighborhood of $300 if you want to enjoy this on your home console. You know, I've never played Super Metroid, but so many people swear by it. Between me and you, I can't stand Metroid. You can make it look gorgeous, give it phenomenal music, make it control like the whirling dervishes, but running around aimlessly around a massive maze, it's never appealed to me. But that being said, it is a massively popular game with a massively popular character, Samus, which blew the collective minds of a metric fuck ton of young men back in '87. But this is 1994, and it's the Super version. Now, unlike other games with the word Super in it, Super Metroid isn't a graphical update of a pre-existing game. It's a different plot, and believe it or not, if we look at the chronology of Samus' story to date, it's actually the 8th game. It involves Samus bringing the last Metroid to the Ceres colony to be studied. Mission accomplished, right? Well, no. As soon as Samus dusts off, she gets a distress call from the colony, and thus our journey begins. Now, the regular release of Super Metroid Loose isn't that bad. It's like $70. It's still kind of expensive to me, but we're talking about the not-for-resale version. Like most not-for-resale games, it's expensive, and Super Metroid not-for-resale goes for roughly $310. To me, it's so much more worth getting the regular version of a game. Not-for-resales, when they come up in conversation, is the equivalent of that scene from American Psycho where they're comparing business cards. Nobody gives a shit. Rare as a company started their careers in the arcade way back during the time of the Nintendo Versus system with Versus Slalom. But for a long time, they didn't make arcade games. They focused on home consoles. Versus Slalom was released in 1986, and it wouldn't be until 1993 that they would re-enter the arcade market again with a game called X the Ball, which is it's a horrible game. It's not good. Don't play it. It's about as thrilling as listening to your grandparents fucking at 2 a.m. in the bedroom next to you. Just don't. But the one game that Rare had anything to do with that was exciting was Killer Instinct. Killer Instinct took the tournament fighter genre and flipped it on its head. It took elements that were popular from other successful fighting games and somehow managed to make it more badass, and the badassery is mostly tied to the combo system. This is a game where you can put in a coin, you can sit back and watch as your DNA gets procedurally rearranged by an incredibly angry AI, sitting back and twiddling your thumbs, doing nothing, because you can't do anything. Not until you hear, and thinking to yourself, hey, game,
Go fuck yourself!
And then they ported it to the Super Nintendo, and it's not a bad game. It's pretty damn faithful if you ask me. But again, it's the not for resale version, and it fluctuates. You'll see it move from the high 200s to the mid 300s. Which character in your opinion is the best, and why is it Jago? That should stir the pot a little bit. Feel free to tell everyone down below. Can I jive with you for a moment? I've made a conscious effort to avoid talking about Rhea's system games because they're all as fun as passing a kidney stone the size of a boulder. For those of you who don't know, Rhea published Packy and Marlin, Captain Novolin, and Rex Ronan Experimental Surgeon, a game where you go inside a dude's body and cleanse him of whatever is ailing him. Bronchi is an educational platformer that exists to teach children about asthma. Asthma! I shit you not. The whole story revolves around meteors that hit this fictional town of Sansorian and pushed dust into the air, introducing asthma to the dinosaur land. Now, the dinosaurs were smart. They built a wind machine to push all of the debris away, but one bad guy, Mr. Rexo, decided to steal it. And now Bronchi and his assorted group of mascot rejects are off to save the planet from cigarettes, animal allergies, and tar. You know, if you have $350 laying around and you want to own this, be my guest. This is a hard pass for me, right? No thank you. I'd rather watch Rachel Cook explain how my brain is an egg and how destroying my kitchen is the equivalent of my parents being disappointed in me for doing drugs. This one is a great one though. Personally, I don't really care for the idea of it. I find it to be overrated, but then again, I've never played it. So for anyone thinking, you haven't checked it out, shut up, go boil some cabbage, yeah, you'd be right in saying that. I should check it out before I make a snap judgment. And at some point I do plan to play it fully, but with my rules of release, I need to beat Mother first on the Famicom. Now, one thing that's interesting about Earthbound is that for the most part, it was always expensive. The game retailed for $69.95 in 1995, and with inflation, that means it was about $140 to $150 today. It was one of those big box games, named so for having a big box that usually had something else accommodating it, right? Be it a player's guide, a mouse, or even a justifier in the case of Lethal Enforcers. That was the first hurdle. The second hurdle was that in Japan, Mother 2 had a very culturally relevant pun and humor-based satirical advertising campaign that was localized quite poorly in America. Do you remember the "This Game Stinks" scratch and sniff from Nintendo Power issue 63? That played a rather large role in people turning away from it. To this day, Earthbound remains incredibly expensive. You'll often find it loose for $280 to $380, but to have anything from the big box, you're looking at about $650, provided the seller isn't one of those goons who price gouge. Before we continue, I do want to point out that we are currently working towards a major milestone of 8,000 subscribers, and if we accomplish that, I'll make a special video of the community's choosing. Currently, roughly 67% of the folks watching my videos aren't subscribed, so feel free to join the community. It's a great time, and I would personally love to have you here. Let's get back to the action. Final Fight is a great game in the arcades. I was never keen on it being on the Super Nintendo. I thought it sounded less than stellar, that it didn't play as well, but honestly, I might go back and check it out one day. It's been quite a long time since I've played it. As a little catch-up, Final Fight was originally supposed to be Street Fighter 89, but that idea was scrapped and Final Fight was born. It was an awesome arcade beat-em-up, and for me, it was the first Capcom beat-em-up that I ever played, and if I recall, it was the first Capcom beat-em-up ever created. To me, it set a little bit of a standard that games such as Renegade and Double Dragon fell short on. In fact, Capcom's beat-em-ups alone are some of my favorite arcade games to play nowadays. They hit a special formula and rebranded it quite often, be it Dungeons & Dragons, The Punisher, or even Alien vs. Predator. But Final Fight, that's where it all started. We could choose Hager, the mayor, Cody, an expert fighter, and Guy, a ninja cosplayer. That's dope. We have variety. These characters play differently, and that's a plus, right? So I'm sure that when Capcom ports it to the Super Nintendo, we'll have that same variety, right? Nope. Sure won't. The original release of Final Fight omitted Guy, leaving us to choose either Hager or Cody. That made people confused, but not so confused that they didn't buy it. It still sold 1.5 million copies, right? But Capcom did something different. They released a second version called Final Fight Guy that included Guy, but nixed Cody. And it was initially created as a Blockbuster exclusive before getting a very limited release. This game commands a shitty price, and that price usually hovers around $450 loose. I've even seen it go complete in box for about $4,000. It's insane. Do you enjoy farming? This game might be for you. Originally known as Farm Story in Japan, that's all that Harvest Moon is. We play as Pete, who maintains a farm that he inherited from his grandfather, and we have to basically clean it up. We do everything that one would do on a farm, and in many ways, it's a chore simulator. But the idea of this game kicked off not only a long-standing continuation of the franchise, but also inspired others like Eric Barone, who created Stardew Valley, a game that is eons more fun than Harvest Moon could ever dream of being. This is a classic case of supply and demand. The game simply wasn't released in a large capacity over here, and because of that, it costs about $450, much like Final Fight Guy. But if you wanted to learn Japanese, you could buy the same game for Super Famicom for like 20 bucks. True story. When I first saw this game, I thought it was a soccer game. I recall seeing it on a shelf behind a glass case thinking, why the fuck is a soccer game so rare? Why is it so expensive? Why are people wanting $2,000 for a game about soccer? Well, Hurricanes apparently was a popular British TV show from the good old folks over at Dick Entertainment. Deke if you're cultured. But I'm a toddler when it comes to wiener jokes, and it's the simple things in life that provide me happiness. In today's economy, happiness is good. The show did hop over to the US for one whole season before fading away, and because of that, US Gold had the luxury of making not only a Super Nintendo version, but also a Genesis and a Game Gear release. And guess what? There's no soccer involved. It's an action game where we play as one of the goons going around kicking a soccer ball at bad guys who are trying to keep us from going to the stadium to play a match. Have you tried calling the police, Hurricanes? No? You'd rather take a page from the playbook of Chrysalis Software and make a weird modern take on Soccer Kid? I know I mentioned earlier that this game is relatively expensive, about $2,000 behind the case, but if you want it loose, it can be between $500 to $700. Honestly, this one might be worth emulating unless you are really hard set on owning Hurricanes on the Super Nintendo. We talked about Metal Warriors in another episode that I did. I believe it was the top 10 underrated Super Nintendo games episode, which I'll link down below and at the end of this video. Metal Warriors is a lot like Cybernator on a level that might actually confuse you if you didn't understand how they weren't related at all. It's an amazing game. The way that it flows is damn near perfect, and sitting down and checking it out for the footage, this is a badass time, but it's an expensive badass time. This game costs roughly $400 to $750, with complete copies going for $3,000 easily. But if there was ever a game on this list that made me slightly move my hand towards the make an offer button on eBay, it would be this one. Essentially, it's a mech combat game with run and gun elements that lets us play as a guy who's able to pilot 6 different mechs. And if our mech is about to be destroyed, we can hop out and jump into another one if we manage to find it. But if we do that, it is dangerous. Anything mechanical can essentially one-shot us, and our handgun is really only useful for organic entities like scientists or soldiers. To use that handgun on a mech is the equivalent of fighting a horny grizzly bear with a hot dog. It's just not happening, right? Mad props to LucasArts for making this one though. It's awesome, and I do hope to own it at some point. Pocky and Rocky is interesting. It goes all the way back to 1986 with a game called Kiki Kai Kai, and while I've never played it, and likely many of you have also never played it, it did eventually turn into a series that we all should know, Pocky and Rocky. Now, I've played Pocky and Rocky 1 because I love shooters, always have, always will, but I didn't know that it had a sequel, and I surely didn't know that they released one in 2002 for the Game Boy Advance, but I'm sure we'll get there at some point. Pocky and Rocky 2 is one of those games that are expensive because the supply simply wasn't there. This is a game that commands a high price because finding it in the wild is very difficult. It's truly hard, and you're going to pay about $500 plus for it because people price gouge it more than Martin Shkreli. If it's anything like the first one, I'd be excited to play it, but I couldn't justify dropping that for one game. And that's it for today's episode. What did you think of this list? What expensive Super Nintendo games do you own that you consider impractically expensive? The comment section is a battleground in the making for the opportunity to shine as individual collectors and to sling around some bragging rights. But who knows, maybe you'll expose someone to an amazing game. Our community is one of the most wholesome communities on YouTube, and I'll die on that hill. We're full of folks who simply love remembering a time when life was just a little bit easier to live. And if you made it to the end of this episode, you're already home here, so feel free to join us. Finally, the single most important thing you could do for me is to hit that thumbs up button, as it directly impacts the visibility of the videos and the projects that I work on every single day. As always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes, Fortefyre out.